Barbara Mendes looked down at the blank piece of paper in front of her. Rolling the pen under her fingers across the kitchen table, Barbara wished that writing or talking about her feelings was as easy for her as it was to make a delicious dinner or to embroider a piece of clothing or fine cloth. But it was coming up on Valentine's Day, 1982, and Barbara had decided that this year she was going to give her two daughters not just cards and chocolates, but a letter that told them how much she loved them. Both the girls were at or close to the point where they were becoming teenagers. Dawn was 13 and Christy was 11. And more, Barbara could feel them beginning to pull away from their parents. Not that the girls had ever given Barbara or her husband Robin, known to everyone by his nickname Bob, any trouble, and the pulling away that Barb sensed now was not rebellious or painful. The girls were just growing up, and Barb knew from her own childhood, and now her perspective as a mom, that the time all of them were spending together now in their modest but cozy house tucked away among the woods would not last forever. Taking a deep breath, Barb stopped rolling the pen, she picked it up, she pressed the point carefully onto the paper, and she began to write. She opened with, "My daughters." 5 sentences later, and Barb was finished. Relaxing her grip on the pen, she read over what she had written. Then she put her pen down, she folded the letter, and slipped it into its envelope. But before getting up from the table and getting started on her to-do list of household, church, and work tasks that never seemed to end, Barb turned toward the window and looked out at the cold and snowy Wisconsin winter. She and Bob had lived in Minocqua, a town with 3,300 residents and only 3 traffic lights, ever since their marriage almost exactly 14 years ago on March 2nd, 1962. But even though it was so small, Minocqua was still bigger than the town where Barb had done most of her growing up. Not long after she'd been born, more than 200 miles to the south, in the bustling county seat of Manitowoc, Barb's parents had moved their family up to Boulder Junction, a tiny town of fewer than 500 people. Even if Barb's father, an aircraft mechanic who had served in the Navy during World War II, and her mother, who had stayed home to take care of Barb and her 3 sisters, had not been fairly conservative and religious people, Boulder Junction was so small that Barb might not even have heard about a lot of the cultural, political, and technological changes of the 1960s that started just a few years before Barb and Bob had gotten married. So, while other young couples in other parts of the country might be experimenting with sex, drugs, and rock and roll music, Barb and Bob had settled here in Minocqua, in their 3-bedroom house located just a half-mile away from sleepy Route 70 and the family-owned upholstery business where Bob worked. And for Barb, who was quiet and shy, this life suited her just fine, because Barb had never really needed that much anyway to make her feel grateful and blessed. Staring now at the snow-covered pine trees outside, Barb thought ahead to the arrival of spring and summer, and how she and her girls had always made the most of those 2 magical seasons, going out together to pick the berries that Barb would make into jars of fruit jellies and preserves, and enjoying the lakes that Minocqua was famous for in this part of the Northwoods. And always, as the girls got older, Barb had made a point of welcoming her daughter's friends for playdates and sleepovers, and doing everything she could to make sure that Minocqua felt less like a small town that people couldn't wait to leave, and more like the storybook version of Little House on the Prairie, where childhood was wholesome, fun, and safe. In fact, the biggest transformation in the social lives of Barb and Bob Mendes and their 2 kids had happened 3 years earlier. And it had nothing to do with popular culture and trends, and everything to do with the family's spiritual life. That was when Barb and Bob, along with a handful of other passionate believers in a conservative Christian denomination called Assemblies of God, had helped found a church of their own. Located about 8 miles west of the Mendes house, the new church had very quickly become the center of the family's social as well as spiritual life. Barb had become a Sunday school teacher, and Bob, who was more outgoing than his wife, was one of the church's youth group leaders. For all the Menendezes, church was where they formed their closest friendships. That's where Barb's older daughter, Dawn, could spend time with her best friend Jody, whose father was one of Bob's best friends. Barb's best friend was also a very active member of the church. Sherry Anderson, whose husband, Wendell, was the pastor, was as close to a confidant as the very private and reserved Barb Mendes had. It had been with Sherry's support and encouragement that Barb had picked up a part-time job starting about a year ago, working as a teller at the Park City Credit Union, which was located roughly halfway between the Mendes home and the Assemblies of God church. And suddenly, with that job, everything Barb could have wanted was within a 10-mile radius of where she sat right now. The church where she worshipped, the bank where she worked, and the family business where Bob worked installing carpets and upholstery. Every member of her family had become well known in this community. Bob out riding his motorcycle to work with his toolkit strapped on the back, the girls going off to school each day, and Barb herself, whose friendly manner and shy but beautiful smile had made her a favorite among the members of Park City Credit Union. But right now, as Barb continued to stare out the window of her kitchen, the Valentine's Day letter in its envelope on the table in front of her, she wondered exactly when and how her life seemed to have slipped out of its perfect frame. There were the recent bank robberies in the area, practically unbelievable in a town that hadn't seen a murder since 1935 and very few violent crimes of any type, and Barb had to admit that even though only one of those robberies was still unsolved, she felt scared every time she saw a customer in the bank who behaved in any way that struck her as out of the ordinary. But Barb also knew that her real trouble lay much closer to home. In fact, she worried that it lay right inside one of her favorite places on earth, the Assemblies of God Church. And lately, when she entered the worship area that meant so much to her and that had been her place of comfort and strength, Barb was now finding excuses to slip away so she could sit by herself in one of the meeting rooms, doing her best to hold back tears. 2.5 months later, on Wednesday, April 28, 1982, Barb packed the family car in the lot right behind the Park City Credit Union, located on Highway 51 in the city of Minocqua. It was a clear, sunny day, cold in the morning, but by afternoon, the temperature was supposed to double. As Barb closed the driver's side door of the car and headed for the bank, she was glad that after the long Wisconsin winter, it was finally starting to warm up. But despite the spring weather and sunshine, when Barb walked inside into the work area of the credit union, she had to force herself to smile as she said good morning to her boss, credit union manager Helen Gray. Because the last 2 days had been hard for Barbara. 2 days earlier, on Monday the 26th, there had been an embarrassing incident at the Bible study meeting that Barb and Bob had gone to at a church member's home. And on the very next day, Tuesday, April 27th, Barb had a long phone conversation with her friend Sherry, the church pastor's wife. Barb could not bring herself to tell Sherry the real secret that weighed so heavily on Barb these days, but Barb did manage to reassure her friend that soon Barb would be taking steps to resolve the problem, and when that was done, Barb would be feeling much better. After ending that phone call, Barb had turned her attention to making dinner. But even though the Mexican food Barb had prepared, Bob's favorite, had gotten rave reviews, the evening had left Barb feeling tired, and she was still tired this morning as she counted the bills in her drawer and took her position behind the customer service counter. Then, as Helen walked across the lobby to open the bank doors for business, Barb gave herself a mental shake. Making sure her white blouse was neatly tucked into her dark skirt, Barb squared her shoulders as the first customer stepped up to her station. But by midday, Barb's workload had unexpectedly doubled. Helen, the bank manager, had started to feel sick, and by 1 p.m., she felt so bad that she and Barb had decided that Helen should just go home and let Barb finish out the day and close the bank on her own. About 4 hours after Helen had left, Barb was helping the last customer of the day, one of the members of the credit union's own board of directors, who was there to convert $55 in change into dollar bills. Even if Barb hadn't been alone for half of her shift, that Wednesday still would have felt like an unusually stressful day. Because that afternoon, Barb had had a scary interaction with a customer named Thomas Bowes, who kicked up a fuss when she told him that because he wasn't a member of the credit union, she could not cash the check he had handed to her. When he came back a second time after filling out a membership card and Barb did cash the check, his irritability and the argument he got into with his brother, who was with him, made Barb wish she was not alone behind the counter. All she'd been able to think about were the 2 recent bank robberies in the area and the fact that the suspect in one of those robberies was still on the loose. Chatting now about that encounter with the credit union board member, Barb relaxed a little as she rolled the last of the coins into its paper sleeve, handed over the dollar bills in exchange, and then walked her final customer to the door. As she watched the man cross the parking lot and get into his car and wave back at her, Barb felt a rush of relief that it was finally 5 o'clock and her workday was almost over. and after locking the door behind her, Barb headed back to the office to start entering that day's transactions into the balance sheet. But Barb hardly had time to sit down, catch her breath, and pull up the credit union balance sheet to make her first few entries when she heard a knock on the front door of the building. Startled, Barb dropped her pencil and looked up. But the entrance to the bank wasn't visible from the desk where she was sitting, and the only way to see who was there knocking was to get up and walk past the service counter and out into the lobby and waiting area. Barb looked at the time. The bank had been closed for almost 15 minutes, but even as Barb was deciding whether she should go to the door and see who it was, or, still thinking about the recent bank robberies, call the police, she heard the knock again. And this time, she thought she could make out a voice she recognized. Taking her hand away from the telephone on her desk, Barb waited a few seconds for her heart to stop racing. Then the 33-year-old wife and mother of two stood up, made a wide loop around the counter, and headed for the front door. A little over 2.5 hours later, at close to 8 p.m. that night, the first police and emergency medical vehicles were pulling up in the parking lot outside the City Park Credit Union, sirens on and lights flashing. There to meet them was the credit union manager, Helen Gray, who had placed the 911 call to the Minocqua Police Department a few minutes earlier at 7:43 p.m. Still in a state of shock, Helen walked into the credit union with police officer Norm McMahon and led him behind the service counter to a space between one of the staff desks and the bank safe located behind the desk and against the side wall of the bank. Sprawled inside of that space, police found the brutally beaten body of Barb Mendes. And even as Helen and the police officer stepped back to let medical technicians check for signs of life, it was clear that Barbara was dead. Her wavy shoulder-length brown hair was matted with blood, and the left side of her skull, face, and ear showed cuts and drag marks from whatever weapon had been used to kill her. From the position of her body, it looked like Barb's attacker had struck her from behind, and at some point during or after the attack, the murderer had rolled her body over so she was lying across her left arm, while her right arm, the fingers curled upward in a loose fist, was stretched out along her right side. Blood from Barbara's injuries had spread out in a wide pool around her head, too much to be fully absorbed by the thick carpet underneath her. The cash drawer at the counter where Barb had worked that day was open, and a total of what would turn out to be $2,700 was missing. The Minocqua Police Department may not have investigated a homicide in almost 50 years, but Officer McMahon's training kicked in right away. After giving directions to secure the crime scene and get crime scene techs to the bank as soon as possible, one of Officer McMahon's first calls was to Barbara's husband, Bob. It had been Bob who had called the manager of the credit union earlier that evening at 7:15 after Barb had failed to show up at church for the 7 p.m. Wednesday service. Even though Barb had called him earlier that day to say that she would be working late, she had also told Bob that she'd be home in time to pick up the girls and join him at church for the 7 p.m. service. Figuring that Helen's home was closer to the bank than the church was, Bob had asked the manager of the credit union if she would make the 1.5-mile trip to Park City Credit Union to check on Barb. Already feeling guilty that she had left Barb alone to close up the bank that evening, Helen immediately hopped into her car with her daughter and did what Bob asked her to do. And just 27 minutes later, Helen had made her gruesome discovery, and with shaking hands, she had dialed 911. But even as police were setting up a perimeter of yellow crime scene tape around the bank and arranging for Bob to identify his wife's body, investigators from both the Minocqua Police Department and the Oneida County Sheriff's Department, which had also responded to the emergency call, had already put together two possible theories that would explain the crime scene and Barb's murder. The first theory was that Barb had been the tragic victim of a bank robbery gone wrong. That theory fit neatly with the fact that there had been a recent rash of robberies in the area, that the perpetrator in one of the robberies was still at large, and that approximately $2,700 was missing from Barb's cash drawer. The second theory was that the motive for the murder was personal, and that Barb's attacker had made off with the money so it would look like a robbery. This theory, that Barbara knew her attacker, would explain why there was no sign of forced entry into the credit union, why the assailant had not taken any of the $17,000 in cash that was sitting in plain sight inside the open safe just a few feet away from Barb's body, and why Barb's attacker was apparently able to walk right up behind her and strike her on the back of the head. Over the next 2 months, officers from the Minocqua and nearby Rhinelander police departments, along with the deputies from the sheriff's department, had a total of 10 investigators working more than 12 hours a day on the Barbara Mendes homicide. With other officers also donating their off-duty time to help, law enforcement would interview more than 100 witnesses, as well as follow up on a barrage of tips and rumors. They had questioned people who had transacted business at the credit union that day, as well as shoppers and store owners at the business center near the bank. They had combed the wooded areas along Highway 51 where the credit union was located, looking for a murder weapon they did not find, and they had collected as much physical evidence from the crime scene as possible without coming up with any blood samples or fingerprints that would lead them to a possible killer. But despite the hours that law enforcement had poured into this investigation, by mid-May, 6 weeks after Barb's death, police investigating both theories of the crime had hit one dead end after another. As the husband of the victim, Barb Mendes was automatically at the top of the suspect list. But Bob was also among the first suspects that police had to cross off their list. From the time Bob arrived home from work at Lakeland Upholstery at about 5 p.m. until sometime after 8 p.m. when he arrived at the Park City Credit Union, Bob could account for all his actions and whereabouts. Bob's alibi was confirmed 3 days later when they followed up their initial interviews with Bob and Barb's daughters, Dawn and Christy, with long interviews at the police station where they took down the family members' formal statements. Both Dawn and Christy, who had gotten home from school on the day of their mother's murder at about 4:20 p.m., had seen their dad come home about a half hour later, just before 5 p.m. Just after 5, their dad had passed along a phone message from their mom telling them she'd be home by 6:15 or 6:30. And since Dad would be riding his motorcycle to church that evening, Barb would drive the girls to the 7 p.m. service with her. After that phone call, Bob and the girls had a quick dinner of tacos. Dawn's best friend Jody had also spoken to Bob around 5:15 or 5:30 when she telephoned the Mendes house, and Bob had answered the phone. After that, Bob had showered, dressed, and then hopped on his 1979 Honda CX-5000 motorcycle and left for church, where church members would see him at about 6:20 p.m. But aside from confirming that Bob did not leave the church again until he got the call from police that Barb was dead, members of the Assemblies of God Church just did not seem that eager to share information about each other's lives and church politics or gossip with police. And Barb's funeral service, which was held on the same day that Christy, Dawn, and Bob were all formally interviewed, did not offer any clues about Barb's personal life either. As a few police officers watched from their seats in the back of the church, 300 mourners filled into the sanctuary of the Assemblies of God on Town Line Road. Pastor Wendell Anderson described Barb as, quote, a woman who had committed her life to the Lord, end quote, before reading some of Barb's favorite verses from the Bible. The next day, the local newspaper would quote one of Barb's friends and fellow church members as saying that Barbara's death, quote, did not fit her life in any way, end quote. And then, this friend summed up the fear that had gripped the entire town of Minocqua in the wake of Barb's murder, the first homicide the sleepy town had seen since 1935. Quote, it's all just horrible, end quote. Meanwhile, as the Minocqua Police Department started focusing its efforts on finding suspects who may have had a personal motive for killing Barb, the Oneida County Sheriff's Department was focusing more and more on the theory that Barb was a victim of a robbery gone wrong. And for them, suspect number 1 was Thomas Bowes, the argumentative man who had visited the Park City Credit Union 2 times on April 28th, the day of Barb's murder. Because, as police soon discovered, Thomas had a prior criminal conviction from 5 years earlier for committing a robbery without a weapon. And when Thomas Bowes' wife, Judith, started changing her story about her husband's activities and whereabouts on the day of Barb's murder, Police zeroed in on the man at least one officer privately described as more of a, quote, goof than a danger to society. But, like all the other leads police had uncovered in the case, the Thomas Bowes lead would dry up 9 months after Barb's murder in the end of January 1983, when Thomas passed a lie detector test. And meanwhile, other leads involving other robbery suspects would also hit a dead end. But by the fall of 1982, 3 months before Thomas Bowes was crossed off the suspect list, residents of Minocqua were all talking about a different crime that had just been reported in their local newspapers. And like Barb's death, this crime also involved a member of the Assemblies of God Church on Township Road, the same church that Bob and Barb had helped found 3 years earlier. In October 1982, 6 months after Barb's murder, the church was rocked by an allegation that one of its members had been sexually assaulting a 14-year-old girl. The charge resulted in the perpetrator being sentenced to 4 years of probation, but the scandal also had the effect of breathing new life into the stalled investigation into Barb's murder. Law enforcement had no evidence that linked the two crimes, but officers decided to take another run at interviewing church members about what might have been going on in the church at or around the time that Barb was killed. They also re-interviewed Bob. Barb's husband had raised eyebrows when he'd started dating a new girlfriend earlier that fall, but when police re-interviewed him in October, nothing about his alibi or about the statements his daughters had made to police 6 months earlier had changed at all. And by the spring of 1984, 2 years after Barb had been murdered, the investigation into her death once more stuttered to a halt, and the key players in the drama were all starting to move on with their lives. On March 10th of 1984, Bob had remarried and his new wife had moved into the Mendes house, where she would do her best to fill the terrible hole that Barb's death 2 years earlier had left in the lives of Barb and Bob's daughters, Dawn and Christy. Meanwhile, the sex abuse scandal at the Assemblies of God Church would fade from the headlines. The $5,500 reward for information leading to a conviction in the murder case of Barb Mendes would go unclaimed, and contributions to an educational fund for Dawn and Christy would slow to a trickle. The only other progress in the investigation would be DNA tests that cleared rather than convicted one remaining suspect in the rash of robberies that had occurred near the time of Barb's death, along with a visit to the police from a Minocqua resident who dropped off a particular tool that they thought might match the type of weapon that had been used to beat Barbara Mendes to death. So this tool that was dropped off was an example of what the murder weapon could have been, not the actual murder weapon. Investigators established the Minocqua resident's alibi, they took a picture of the tool, made a note, and filed the information away inside a case file that now included thousands of pages. And if it hadn't been for the sheer persistence and determination of Barbara's own daughters, that huge case file might never have been opened again. Because, in the course of getting on with their own adult lives, both Christy and Dawn had joined forces and become determined not to rest until they had discovered who had killed their mother. Starting back in 2002, 20 years after Barbara was murdered, Dawn, now 33 years old, and Christy, now 31 years old, began a relentless campaign aimed at getting police to reopen the investigation into their mother's death. That included writing a letter in 2016 to the producers of the true crime television show titled Cold Justice, asking them to take a look into the unsolved murder of their mother. And in February of 2017, the two women finally got the response they had been pleading for. 35 years after Barb's murder, and almost a year after dropping that letter off in the mail, the Cold Justice team of investigators accepted the challenge. And 1 year after that, police, with the help of the investigators from Cold Justice, finally closed in on a murderer who had eluded them for more than 3 decades. When the arrest came on February 6, 2018, nearly 36 years after Dawn and Christy first learned that their mother was dead, it was the result of an intense 2-week-long partnership between Cold Justice and the Oneida County Sheriff's Office. During those 2 weeks, the team of investigators reviewed the entire case file on the murder of Barbara Mendes from beginning to end. and after hiring a forensic weapons expert to help identify what instrument was used to kill Barb, and talking again with 3 key witnesses, as well as Barb's old church friend Sherry Anderson, wife of church pastor Wendell Anderson, police uncovered the truth about one of the most infamous murders that has ever occurred in the Northwoods of Wisconsin. Based on that investigation, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Barbara Mendes on April 28, 1982. By the time 33-year-old Barbara Mendes had closed and locked the door of the Park City Credit Union on that Wednesday evening in late April, she was physically and emotionally exhausted. She'd been thinking over the events of the last several days and about the concerns she had shared with her friend Sherry when they talked by phone just the night before. But Barbara had not told Sherry everything, and even now, knowing what Barb did, Barb wasn't sure that Sherry or anyone else at the church would really be able to understand the decision that Barb felt like she had to make. Walking back to her desk, Barb sat down and started making her first entries into that day's bank transaction record. The quicker she could get this done, the sooner she would be home with her 2 daughters, and the sooner they would all be at the 7 p.m. church service where Barb could talk again to her friend Sherry. 10 minutes later, the sudden and unexpected knock on the front door of the bank made Barb jump. Her first thought was that it might be a bank robber, and Barb felt her heart start to hammer in her chest. But as soon as Barb heard the voice that was calling to her from outside the bank, she stopped reaching for the phone to call police. This was a voice that Barb recognized, and this was a conversation that Barb knew she could no longer avoid having. Taking a deep breath, Barb pushed her chair back, stood up, and began walking towards the door. For Barb's killer, as well as for Barb, this was a moment of decision. And standing now in the shadow of the entryway to the credit union, the killer listened first to the silence inside, and then to the sound of footsteps, and then to the key turning in the lock. A moment later, and the killer was inside. The killer reached out a hand, but Barb moved away. Turning, she walked back over to her desk. She had read the Bible. She knew what the scriptures had to say about the kind of relationship she had observed and the kind of person who got involved in that sort of relationship. Their conversation did not last long. The killer had denied everything, but Barb had spent weeks watching and listening, and Barb could no longer stand by and let this relationship go on. The killer stood in front of her and bowed their head. Barb reached down and picked up the bills she had collected out of the cash drawers. Signaling that the visit was now over, Barb turned her back and took 3 steps in the direction of the open safe. All she wanted now was to end this encounter, to finish her work, and to get home to her kids. But the killer could not let that happen. As soon as Barb had turned toward the safe, the killer reached into their coat pocket to pull out the metal pry bar they had hidden there. The flat end of the tool fit comfortably in their hand. At the other end of the shaft, the claw tip bent at an angle, giving the tool the same overall shape as a short flat crowbar with flat, sharp, beveled ends. Quietly, the killer took a single long step toward Barb's back. Once they were just within striking distance, the killer raised the pry bar high over their left shoulder and then brought it down with terrible force against the back left side of Barb's skull. Once Barb had collapsed to the floor, the killer stepped over to her body. Grabbing her right arm, the killer rolled Barb onto her side so her left arm was stretched underneath her chest. Tightening their grip on the pry bar, the killer bent down and began beating Barb's head and the left side of her face, dragging the curved end of the bar again and again through her hair and skin, making ragged cuts and scratches across her cheek and tearing away part of her left ear. The autopsy that would be performed on Barb's body the next day, Thursday, April 29th, would catalog a total of at least 17 blows to Barbara's head, all resulting in extensive skull fractures. The total absence of any defensive wounds suggested that the attack took Barb completely by surprise, and the first blow was so disabling that Barb never even had a chance to fight back or protect herself in any way. Now, looking down at Barb's body, the killer rested their palms against their knees. The pry bar in the fingers of one hand glistened red in the single overhead light. Waiting to catch their breath, the killer watched as the pool of blood under Barb's head widened across the carpet. And then, standing up, the killer set about making the murder look like the scene of a robbery gone wrong. In a few fast movements, the killer had grabbed a deposit bag from Barbara's desk that contained about $2,700 in that day's transactions, leaving Barbara's cash drawer behind the service counter open and empty. Pausing just long enough to make sure they were not leaving anything behind that could reveal their identity, the killer walked to the front entrance with the pry bar and bag of cash, and then, making sure not to leave any fingerprints, the killer slipped out of the Park City Credit Union. Glancing at their watch, the killer was surprised to find that the entire encounter with Barb, ending with her death, had taken fewer than 10 minutes. Still, it was the critical window of time, part of maybe 30 minutes that police would come up with as the time the murder was committed, and the killer knew they had to find a way to place themselves during this half-hour period far away from the credit union. But the killer wasn't worried. After all, teenagers did not really pay very close attention to what time it was, and the killer knew it would be easy to manipulate and coach the people closest to him into providing him with the perfect alibi. A few minutes later, just after 5:30 p.m., Barb Mendes, Barbara's husband and killer, arrived back at the family home on Hill North Dale Road. The bloody pry bar that he had just used 15 minutes earlier to murder his wife was securely locked in the toolbox on the back of his Honda CX-5000 motorcycle. And by the morning of May 1st, 3 days after Barb's death, the most important pieces of Bob's plan to cover up for his crime fell neatly into place. When investigators brought Bob and his 2 daughters down to the police station that morning to give their formal statements about where they were and what they were doing on the evening that Barbara was murdered, the only times that the 2 devastated teenagers could seem to remember about exactly where their father was between 4:55 and 6:45 on the night of their mother's murder were the times that their father had told them. Yes, Dawn and Christy told investigators, their father had been home before 5 p.m. Yes, he had stayed at the house until close to 6 p.m., when he had left on his motorcycle to drive to church. And Bob still had one more important witness that he could also count on for helping him create a watertight alibi. And that person was his daughter Dawn's best friend, 14-year-old Jody, the teenager that Bob had been sexually abusing for almost an entire year, the teenager that Bob had promised to marry as soon as he could end his marriage to Barb. It would turn out that Barb Mendes was not at all the good Christian and the fine husband and devoted father he pretended to be. And by February of 1982, when his wife, Barb Mendes, sat down to write a Valentine's Day letter to her 2 daughters, Barb had already begun to put together the true picture of who her husband was. Not only did Barb know that her marriage was in trouble, she had also begun to suspect that her husband was involved in an inappropriate relationship with a girl who was just barely 14 years old. And not only was this girl close friends with their own daughters, Jody was also the daughter of Bob's own best friend, as well as a member of Bob's youth group at the Assemblies of God Church on Township Road. By the spring of 1982, rumors and whispers had begun to swirl inside the church about the amount of time and attention that Bob was lavishing on Jody. And members also noticed that Bob and Barb Mendes no longer sat together at church services, and on one occasion, they had arrived in separate cars at a Bible study meeting at a member's home, with Barb looking and acting so visibly upset that everyone in the group had felt extremely uncomfortable and embarrassed. By late April, Barb had begun to confide to her friend Sherry that she was worried about the relationship between Bob and Jody, and that Barb had decided she needed to confront her husband. If he did not stop all contact with Jody and start working on his marriage, Barb had decided she was going to take her daughters and leave Bob and go stay with her own parents, who now lived out in Colorado. But Barb never had the chance to put that plan into effect and to help rescue a vulnerable teenage girl from an abusive relationship with Barb's husband. Instead, on April 28th, Bob, the only person aside from the bank manager who knew Barb would be closing the credit union alone that evening, showed up after finishing his work at Lakeland Upholstery at the Park City Credit Union. Armed with the pry bar he used almost every day and carried with him in his toolbox, Bob knocked on the locked door of the bank and called out to Barb, telling her that he needed and wanted to talk. And just a few minutes after opening the door to Bob, Barb had been beaten to death by her husband of 14 years. After Barb's murder, Jody, who had also been coached and manipulated by Bob, joined with his daughters in giving him a fake alibi. It wouldn't be until 6 months later, when police investigated allegations that Bob was sexually abusing Jody, that Jody broke down and told police that she had been lying when she said that she had talked to Bob on the Mendes house phone at about 5 p.m. on the night that Barb was killed. But laws and public perception regarding sexual abuse were a lot different in 1982 than they are today, and police were skeptical about Jody's corrected testimony. And even though Bob pled no contest to the charges and was convicted of sexual assault on a minor, he was only sentenced to 3 years of probation. Meanwhile, 14-year-old Jody was savaged in the press and by her own father for being a temptress and a slut and an adulterer. But even though Bob's now public relationship with Jody gave him a motive for wanting his wife Barb dead, he still had the perfect alibi, the one provided by his deeply traumatized daughters, Christy and Dawn. It wasn't until 2002, when the daughters were in their early 30s and started looking back over their childhood, and in particular their father's behavior after their mother was murdered, that they began to realize how obviously and completely they had been coached, manipulated, brainwashed, and used by their own father, the man who never even purchased a headstone for his dead wife and who never once took his kids to see her grave. The man who had been seen by 2 different witnesses leaving the credit union on his motorcycle during the window of time in which the murder was committed, the man who suddenly had enough cash right after that murder to buy himself an expensive new motorcycle and who painted his motorcycle helmet a different color, the man who failed a lie detector test 5 weeks after the murder of his wife, the man who not only sexually assaulted their own good friend Jody, but who would later go to prison for 8 years for sexually abusing a 5-year-old girl, and the man whose own brother would go to the Oneida County Sheriff's Department in 2002 and suggest that the murder weapon they were looking for might be a pry bar, one of the tools that his brother, Barb Mendes, used so often at work that Bob took it with him everywhere in his portable toolkit. But it wouldn't be until 2017, when investigators from the TV series Cold Justice teamed up with the Oneida County Sheriff's Department, that law enforcement was finally able to break Barb Mendes's perfect alibi. Not only did they now have the testimony of Bob's own daughters that the alibi was fabricated, they were also able to track down and interview Jody, the survivor of Bob's sexual abuse. Now a successful adult in a happy marriage, Jody had gone on to work in law enforcement and to be a voice for other victims of crime and abuse. And this time, investigators believed her testimony that she had not spoken to Bob at his home during the critical window of time when police believed Barb had been murdered. On February 6, 2018, Robin Bob Mendes was arrested in the parking lot of a Minocqua Walmart store and charged with the first-degree murder of his wife, Barbara Mendes. On July 23, 2019, Bob Mendes was sentenced to life in prison. Because he was sentenced under guidelines in force at the time of the crime, 1982, he will be eligible for parole in 2039 at the age of 91. Included in the documents that Dawn and Christy had sent to the producers of Cold Justice when they asked the show's investigators to take on the unsolved murder of their mother was the Valentine's Day letter that Barbara had written to her daughters 35 years earlier. Barb's friends and family now believe that by mid-February 1982, 6 weeks before Barb was bludgeoned to death by her husband, Barb had begun to suspect Bob of sexual abuse, and that Barb herself may have felt that dark events were about to unfold in their lives. This is the Valentine's Day message that Barb wrote to 11-year-old Christy and 13-year-old Dawn with all of that in mind. My daughters. Sometimes mothers don't always take the time to tell their daughters just how much they are loved and appreciated. Our lives can go by so fast and we will have missed so much together. So, on this Valentine's Day, I want to tell you how much I love you. You are so special to me as daughters. Have a nice Valentine's Day and every day. I love you, your mother. On September 6, 2006, 51-year-old Susan Kuhnhausen was returning from her job as an emergency room nurse in Portland, Oregon. On the way, she stopped at a hair salon to get her hair dyed. While she waited her turn, she picked up a magazine and a particular quote stood out to her. It said, "I will not live an unlived life. I will not live in fear." At the time, Susan was fighting with her husband Mike. They had been married for nearly 18 years, and their marriage had become toxic, and Susan had finally gotten the courage up to tell Mike she wanted a divorce, and Mike did not want a divorce. And so they had these bitter, awful fights, and Susan was just looking for things to latch onto, and this type of quote gave her motivation to follow through with this very difficult decision. About an hour later, with her hair now a slightly different color brown, she hopped back in her car and drove the last couple of miles home to her quiet little neighborhood. She pulled into the driveway of her one-story Cape Cod home with their gray picket fence around it. She went in the back door into their mudroom, and right away she saw a note next to the microwave that her husband had left, because at this time they were still living together. And the note just said, "Sue, I've had trouble sleeping. I've gone to the beach. I'll see you in a couple of days." She put the note down and then unlocked the door that led into the house, which was into the kitchen. And as soon as the door opened up, she heard the beeping sound of their security alarm. And then she walked all the way through the house to the front door. She unlocked it, went outside, and then checked their mail, and then went back inside the house. After she got back inside and had shut and locked the front door behind her, she kicked off her shoes and then began walking across the house towards the kitchen. She got about halfway there when she looked over to her left, and she noticed the first floor bedroom that they used as a guest room was really dark. And every morning before she left for work, she would open all the curtains around the house. And so in the evening, the sun would come into the house and it would be nice and bright. And so she's thinking to herself, did I forget to open the curtains in that room? Because it shouldn't be that dark. And as she's staring at the room, a man she didn't recognize walked out from behind the bedroom door and started walking towards her. He was medium height, medium build. He had a hat pulled down over his eyes. He had yellow rubber gloves on, and he was holding a hammer. And he began walking right towards her. For many people, the sight of a stranger inside of your home carrying a hammer would be enough to prompt you to turn around and run out of your house. But not Sue. She had been an emergency room nurse for the past 30 years, and in that time, she had done things like crack open people's ribs to massage their hearts, she had administered IVs and thrashing patients that were suffering from withdrawals, and she and the other nurses she worked with trained regularly in self-defense, because you just never knew what was going to happen in the ER. You needed to be ready to slip chokeholds and defend yourself. And so here Sue was, staring down this intruder in her house with 30 years of preparation for this moment. And so Sue ran at this guy faster than he was coming at her, and it caught him off guard. She figured if she could just get up close to him, the power of the hammer strikes would be less. And so she rams into him, and she's about 5'5" and significantly outweighed him. He's about 5'9", maybe 200 pounds. And so she rams him into the wall. He hits her in the head once with the hammer, but it wasn't enough to subdue her or even knock her down. She barely felt it. And so she's holding on to him and she's screaming at him, "Who are you? What do you want?" Because there was a part of her that thought, this is a burglary. I'll just give you what you want. But the guy didn't say anything. And so Susan grabbed him and pushed even harder against the wall. And the man would say 2 words. It was the only 2 words he said the entire time. And it was, "You're strong." And Susan, when she heard that, it was like an adrenaline rush. She knew this guy was not trying to rob her. He was just trying to kill her. And she thought, no, I'm gonna live. And she managed to wrestle the hammer away from him while pinning him against the wall, and then smashed him in the head 3 times with this hammer before he managed to get it back. But when he reached for the hammer, she grabbed his throat and began choking the life out of him. The man immediately went for his throat to get her hand off of him, so he was not trying to attack her. And Susan realized that she had him on the defensive, and she grabbed tighter and tighter around his throat. She moved her other hand up and really started crushing his windpipe. And then she screamed at him, "I'll call an ambulance if you tell me who sent you." And the man looked at her and just grunted at her. And so she continued to squeeze harder and harder until his face turned purple and his eyes rolled back. And she knew as an emergency room nurse, if she continued, she would kill him. And she wasn't really prepared to do that. And so she threw him to the ground. She turned and began to run towards the front door. But this guy jumped up and leapt after her, grabbed her by the ankle and tripped her to the ground. When she landed, she rolled over onto her back, and right on top of her is this guy wielding the hammer, and he's about to bring it down on her. And so she instinctively just shot up. She sat up as fast as she could, and she bit down as hard as she could on the inner part of his upper leg. She bit so hard she tore through the fabric. And the guy screamed out in pain. He couldn't even hit her with the hammer. He began staggering back, at which point she released the bite, got up onto a knee, and then bit him again on the side of his rib cage as hard as she could, once again tearing through the fabric. And so now this guy is howling at the top of his lungs, at which point Sue grabs him and throws him to the ground, but she falls with him, and she lands directly behind his back. and he's still trying to grab her, and he's got the hammer and he's trying to hit her. And so she reaches out and puts her arm over his throat and puts him in a wicked chokehold, one that he was not getting out of. And so the guy is trying to fight and get his neck out of the chokehold, but Susan decided that this guy, he's not going to talk, he's not going to tell me what he wants, he's here to kill me, so I'm going to kill him first. And she proceeded to choke him to death. Once he stopped moving, she calmly stood up, looked down, knew he was dead. She grabbed his hammer and then calmly walked out the front door, walked to her neighbor's house, knocked on the door, and then her neighbor comes up and sees Sue just standing there with her clothes tattered and she's all bruised and bloodied, but she looks like she's totally okay. And the neighbor asks Sue, what are you doing? What's going on? Why do you have that hammer? And Sue would tell her that, well, I had an intruder and he tried to kill me, so I killed him, and I need to use your phone to call the police. And so her neighbor's like, okay, come on in and use my phone. And so Sue walks in with her hammer in hand and calmly calls the police and tells them what happened. Police and paramedics show up and they go inside of Sue's house and they confirm that her attacker was in fact dead. And her attacker turned out to be 59-year-old Ed Haffey, who was a Vietnam veteran with a long rap sheet. They discovered Ed's backpack inside of Susan's house, and in it was a notebook that contained instructions for what to do after he killed Susan. And one of those instructions was to call Mike. It turns out this Mike was Susan's husband. He had paid Ed $50,000 to kill his wife. And Mike, earlier in the day, had gone to the house and allowed Ed in and told him where to go and where to wait. And then on his way out, he had written that note saying, I'll see you in a couple of days. When police brought Mike in, he initially denied all charges and said he had nothing to do with this, but he would eventually confess and then would be sentenced to 7 years in prison for soliciting to murder his wife. Although Mike never gave his exact motivations for why he actually did this, he would have been ruined financially during this divorce, but if Susan were to die, he would inherit the house. Immediately after his sentencing, Susan sued Mike for $1 million, claiming she wanted to make sure he didn't have any more money so that he couldn't go hire another hitman to finish the job. Susan didn't have to worry for very long though, because Mike would die shortly thereafter in prison. As for Susan, she never faced any criminal charges and in fact was hailed as a hero in the wake of the attack. Our second and final story is called Dr. Ramsey. In 1978, a 9-year-old girl named Kim was walking to the corner store to get some pasta sauce for her mother. On her walk home, a man she had never met before walks up behind her and speeds up to where he's walking in step with her. And he looks at her and introduces himself and says, "Hi, I'm Dr. Ramsey. I'm a pediatrician. Do you know what a pediatrician is?" And Kim immediately had a bad vibe about this Dr. Ramsey character. There was just something odd about him. The fact that he had approached her so suddenly and was right on top of her. So her reaction was to not answer his questions and instead put her head down and walk even faster because she knows she's almost at her house. She's almost at safety. And if she can just get there, she doesn't have to deal with this strange man. But as she sped up, so too did Dr. Ramsey, staying in step with her, and he begins peppering her with additional questions and comments. "Are your parents looking for a pediatrician for you?" "Of course they are. You're a big girl now. How old are you? What's your name? Your hair is so beautiful. Where do you live?" When Kim got to be about 10 meters away from her house, she just takes off running and she bolts up her back steps through the kitchen door into her house, slams the door behind her, and for a few seconds she just stands there, almost anticipating hearing this Dr. Ramsey guy come up the back steps behind her. But he doesn't, and after a couple of minutes, she pokes her head around and looks out the window, and he's not there anymore, and she feels completely relieved that that weird guy is now gone and she can just forget about it. But it turns out she couldn't just forget about this because Dr. Ramsey was not going away anytime soon. It wasn't long after this first initial interaction with Dr. Ramsey that Kim was home one day and she happened to be looking out her front window to the road and she sees a blue Ford Galaxy drive slowly by their property. And she's looking at the car and she can tell immediately that the person driving it is Dr. Ramsey. But Dr. Ramsey doesn't see her. She's kind of obscured behind curtains on the window, and she's watching him, and he was looking at their front door, and he was waving as if there was someone standing on their front steps, but Kim knew there wasn't. And so he bizarrely just drove the rest of the way past their property, waving the whole time, and then drove off. Now at this point, Kim has not told her mom or her dad or her siblings about Dr. Ramsey because that first interaction, she kind of chalked it up to maybe her being paranoid and maybe even being a little bit rude that she ran away from this doctor who was just trying to talk to her. But now that she's seen him drive past her house and he's acting strange, her alarm bells are starting to go off, but she doesn't tell her parents quite yet. But the next day, when Kim was playing outside, a car drove by and she turned to look at it, and it was the blue Ford Galaxy, and who was driving? Dr. Ramsey. And he slows down and he waves to her and he smiles at her as he passes by, and she kind of looks at him like, what are you doing? At this point, Kim knows he's acting inappropriately. Whatever his angle is, it just didn't feel right. So she runs inside and she explains to her mom that when she went to the store to get that pasta sauce on her way back, this strange man, Dr. Ramsey, approached her. She came back to the house. Now I've seen him twice outside of our property and he's clearly waving at me. There's something wrong with this guy. Kim's mother reacted to this news the way most of us would, which is, you're talking about a doctor in this nice neighborhood who's driving down the road saying hi to my kid and he claims he's a pediatrician? Like, that's a child's doctor. It makes sense he might be waving to kids. That's part of his job, talking and interacting with kids. And so her mother says this can't be a big deal. I'm sure he just works in the area and this is part of his commute going down this road, and now you've seen him a couple days in a row. It's just a coincidence. But shortly after this, when Dr. Ramsey started calling their house, Kim's mother and father very quickly ditched the "he's a doctor so we can trust him" routine and became very concerned. A couple of days after Kim had told her mother about Dr. Ramsey, Kim gets called into the living room where her father's sitting, and he looks very troubled, and he calls her over and has her sit down, and he says, "You're not in trouble. I just need you to talk me through exactly what happened when Dr. Ramsey approached you. Your mother told me about it, and there's been a couple weird things that have happened here, and I just got to hear the story from you." And so Kim goes through the story. She describes how she was leaving the store. He just kind of showed up, and Kim did not talk to him. She put her head down and basically ran back to the house, and that was it. Kim's father reacts to this like he's totally perplexed about something, that he's hearing the facts, but they don't make any sense. And he says to Kim, "Are you sure you didn't say anything to him?" And Kim said, "No, I was scared. I didn't say anything." And Kim's father's like, "Then how did he know your name?" Kim was like, "What do you mean?" And her father said, "Well, just the other day, I got a phone call from someone saying they were Dr. Ramsey, and they asked to speak with you, Kim, by name. They said, 'Can I speak to Kim?' And I thought that was odd because, you're my child." And I said, "Well, why do you need to speak to my daughter? Why can't you speak to me? I'm her father. You're a doctor, you can speak to me." And they hung up. And then they called back again, and they asked for you by name again, as if they hadn't heard me the first time. And so I said again, "Why do you need to talk to my daughter? You can just talk to me, I'm her parent." At which time they hung up again. And so I wanted to hear from you directly if you had given your name to him, because the fact that he knew your name on that call seems really odd to me. Kim assured her father that she did not give him her name. And you got to remember that this is back in 1978, so Dr. Ramsey would not have been able to use the internet to try to find Kim's name, nor would Kim's name have been listed in a telephone book because she was a minor. It would have been her father or her mother that was listed in the telephone book. So in order for Dr. Ramsey to have her name, he would need to know someone that would give up her name or do some digging, which is obviously very creepy considering the fact that Kim has never met him before. He's a strange older man and she's a 9-year-old girl. So with that in mind, Kim and her parents are on edge about this Dr. Ramsey character, but they don't have any clear recourse because he didn't do anything that was criminal. They couldn't go to the police and say he figured out our daughter's name, because they would be saying a doctor, a pediatrician no less, knows our child's name and was waving and smiling at her. But shortly after this, Dr. Ramsey's behavior would take a dark turn. He would call Kim's house again just a couple of days after those first two calls, and Kim's father would answer, and right away, Dr. Ramsey says, "I need to talk to Kim." And Kim's father goes into protective mode, and he says, "Do not call this house again," and he hangs up. But seconds later, the phone is ringing again, and at this point, the family has come in the room because they heard their father screaming at someone on the phone. The phone's ringing, and their father picks the phone up and puts it back in the receiver, canceling the call. And he looks at his family and he says, "Do not answer the phone." The phone rings again. He picks it up and cancels it again. On and on, the phone rang incessantly all night until they disconnected the phone line. The next day, when they plugged the phones back in, Kim's parents told all of the kids, "Do not answer the phone. No matter what, don't answer the phone." And once again, the phone starts ringing, and Kim's father picks it up. He doesn't say anything, and he hears on the other end of the line, Dr. Ramsey asking for Kim. And he says, "Do not call this house again," and he slams it, thinking that's going to do it, but of course it doesn't. And over the next several days, anytime the phone was plugged in, it was practically a non-stop call from Dr. Ramsey. And one time when Kim's father did pick up the phone, he reacted to it like it was some horrible thing being told to him, and he put it down, he disconnected the phone, and he went into the kitchen. And one of Kim's brothers overhears their father talking to their mother in a hushed tone, and he's saying to her, "He just told me he's going to hurt Kim unless he can speak to her." After this threat was made, things got very complicated. Back in the 1970s, there weren't any stalking laws that would protect Kim and her family from Dr. Ramsey. Even though Dr. Ramsey had just threatened Kim, there was no proof he had done that, and he hadn't done anything physical, and so there wasn't any legal recourse. The police couldn't really do anything. And so Kim's father ends up calling one of his friends who happens to be a police officer. He explains the situation, and he says, "Would you mind for the next little bit just escorting my daughter Kim to and from school, because we don't want her to be out walking around by herself with this guy rolling around the neighborhood." The friend says yes, and he began bringing Kim to and from school, and Kim felt a lot safer with her father's friend because you have this police officer that's walking around with you. But it also isolated Kim in a really major way. She wasn't really allowed to go outside anymore without an escort, which meant her life was confined largely to being inside almost 24/7, and there was no clear resolution in sight for how to handle Dr. Ramsey, and so it was like this indefinite period of time that Kim was just not going to be allowed to have a normal life. Once Dr. Ramsey was completely cut off from any interaction with Kim, I mean, she barely went outside, and when she did, she was with this police escort, and she never answered the phone. Once that was going on, Dr. Ramsey became desperate. One evening, Kim, her sister, two of her brothers, and her mother were in the kitchen chatting when one of her brothers suddenly reacts like he sees something out the back window that leads out to their garage. And he runs over and he's looking out, and Kim and her family are turning to him saying, "What do you see? What's going on?" And he goes, "There's someone in the garage." And they all run to the windows and they're looking out, and there's a window on the side of their garage. Their garage was detached from their house. And there's a window on the side, and there was this man there standing there looking out at them. And once he saw that everybody is looking at him, he ducked his head down. And as Kim's family is looking at each other like, did we really just see someone in the window? Because it's kind of dark and they're not there anymore. Suddenly, the garage door slowly rises up, and out pops a man who stands up, looks at them just long enough that Kim yells, "That's Dr. Ramsey, I saw him, that's Dr. Ramsey." And then the guy takes off down the driveway away from their house, and Kim's two brothers immediately run out the house and chase him down the road, but eventually he darts into another property and he disappears and they can't find him. Kim's mother calls the police, they show up, they take down some statements, and they basically say, "Look, if he comes back, let us know, but for now, just go back in your house and lock the doors and keep an eye out." For 2 weeks after the garage incident, they didn't hear from Dr. Ramsey and they didn't see Dr. Ramsey, and it was this great reprieve from this very stressful time in their lives. But after those 2 weeks, Kim's father walked outside onto their front porch and he saw their beloved German Shepherd was dead lying off the side of the porch. And he goes over to the dog and it looks like it's been roughed up, but it's hard to tell what actually happened to it. Now, at first, the family is absolutely devastated about the loss of their beloved animal. But shortly after that, they start thinking, do you think Dr. Ramsey could have had something to do with the death of our dog? And so Kim's father calls the police and says, "I think our stalker, Dr. Ramsey, killed our dog." But the police would say there was no evidence to suggest anybody killed your dog. It could have just been an accident. Also, we haven't even been able to identify who this Dr. Ramsey person is because there are no Dr. Ramseys in this town. And so probably he's using a fake name. So the family's sad and frustrated, but once again has nothing they can do about this. That night, Kim and her family are sitting at home. They're all very sad about the loss of their dog, and the phone rings. Now, prior to this, there had been 2 weeks where Dr. Ramsey hadn't called once. And so Kim's father picks the phone up and says, "Hello?" And it's Dr. Ramsey. But unlike all the other calls where Dr. Ramsey almost always began with, "Put Kim on the phone," this time he started with, "There are 7 people in your house right now. Your wife's in the kitchen, you're in the living room, your 3 sons are watching TV in the den, and your 2 daughters are upstairs in their respective bedrooms." Kim's father is obviously horrified to hear this because it was all accurate, and he just screams into the phone, "Stay away from my family," and he hangs up. After this phone call, Kim's father was naturally very shaken up by this because even though they knew Dr. Ramsey was probably living in the area, and he clearly drove past the property and was local, it just felt way more intimate for him to be naming things that meant he had to have been near their house recently and looking in windows. And so Kim's father runs around the house and makes sure all windows are shut and locked, blinds drawn, all the doors are locked, and then he goes all around the house to make sure all his kids and his wife and everybody's okay. And then afterwards, he considered calling the police, but felt like it was kind of futile because to this point, they haven't been able to help them and nothing has changed. It was just another creepy phone call. And so they don't do anything. The next day, they plugged their phone line back in because they need to use a phone, and shortly thereafter, the daily calls with Dr. Ramsey began again. And now, every call, whenever they did pick up, started with Dr. Ramsey identifying who was in the house and where they were. After a couple of days of this, the family was just living in paranoia. It was this horrible time in their lives. And one night, the phone rings and Kim's father picks it up, ready to just scream at this guy and take out his frustrations. And Dr. Ramsey, instead of giving the report, starts by saying, "I can open your kitchen window and I can open your French doors to the side of your house." Kim's father is about to yell at him, but instead just hangs the phone up and runs into the kitchen, and he checks the window and he knows it's faulty. And clearly, so does Dr. Ramsey. And so he gets a piece of twine and he ties it over the latch and gets it as tight as he can. And then he ran over to the French doors, which were faulty. You'd have to push pretty hard, but you could, in theory, pop the doors open if you knew these were faulty doors. And so Kim's father is not taking any chances, and he gets some nails out of the junk drawer and he nails a row of nails into the ground, right into the hardwood, sitting immediately outside the frame of the door. So if you were to push on them, you would just butt up against the heads of these nails and it would keep it shut. It was his temporary solution until he ordered a proper lock to fit on the door. At this point, it was safe to say Kim and her family were living in fear that Dr. Ramsey at any given point could just break into their house, because clearly he was canvassing their house and testing different entry points, and he had already found 2. And so now they just felt totally unsafe in their house. But oddly enough, after that last call where Dr. Ramsey had said he knew the kitchen and the doors were faulty, the calls from Dr. Ramsey decreased to almost 0, and they didn't see him anywhere, and it started to feel like maybe he had gotten his thrills and he was moving on now. And it just so happened that around the time the family is starting to think this could be over, the mother and father had to go to this company function where the kids couldn't go. So the kids would be alone, but the kids said, we're fine with it. We have each other. The house will be locked. We won't go anywhere. And the parents, even though they hated the idea of their kids being alone at all because of everything going on with Dr. Ramsey, they felt like, it does seem like he's kind of moved on and we're only going to be gone for a couple of hours, so I'm sure this is going to be fine. So that night, after her parents leave, Kim is sitting on the couch, she's watching TV, her younger brother is laying on the ground right in front of her, and her sister is sitting on the other end of the couch and she's on the phone. And Kim said she found herself looking out of her room into the kitchen towards the side of the house where those French doors were that led out into the side yard, and those doors were still only secured by the nails her father had put into the ground. The lock her father had ordered had not come in yet. Kim found herself looking at these doors, feeling really uneasy about it, and then as she was looking at it, she could have sworn she saw the doors begin to push open. And she's looking at it even more closely, and then for sure, she sees the doors bow inward like someone is pushing on the top and the nails are stopping the bottom. And for a split second, she sees the clear silhouette of Dr. Ramsey. And she screams, it wakes up her sister and her brother, and she's pointing at the double doors. They all look, and once again, he pushes on those doors, exposing himself just for a second to the kids. So now all 3 kids have now seen this guy trying to force his way into their house, and so they scream and run right upstairs. They go into Kim's room, they shut the door, lock it, turn the lights off, and they go over to the window that's looking out to the front of their house. Now, Dr. Ramsey is on the side of the house, so they wouldn't be able to see him through this window, but they're just praying that he does not break through those doors and come in the house. They're hoping they'll see him as he exits the front of their house. And they're kind of keeping an eye out the window, just praying they see this guy leave their property and leave them alone. But they don't see him leave, and they don't hear any noise downstairs or outside. It's just total silence. And they're wondering, did he already get in the house? They decide they need to look for themselves. And so they leave Kim's room and they sneak down the hall to the side room, which was their brother's room, that overlooked the area where Dr. Ramsey would be. They go over to the window and they poke their heads up and look out the window downstairs. And sure enough, there's a man standing right in front of those French doors with his hands on them, kind of looking in, looking around. And at this point, the kids suck themselves down underneath the window so that he doesn't see them. And as they're crouched down, they hear him start banging on the door downstairs, at which point Kim's sister, who was there with her, just says, "What do you want?" The banging stops and the man says, "I have a pizza, come down and get it." Kim and her siblings didn't order a pizza, so they just yell out, "If you don't leave, we're gonna call the cops." And then Kim pokes her head over the window and she looks down and she can clearly see it's Dr. Ramsey, who's now turned and he's running away from their house. Just a couple of minutes later, Kim's two older brothers return. They were out at a skating rink and they come back, they come inside, and Kim and her two younger siblings go up and tell them what happened. And immediately those two run out and start looking for him, but he's long gone by now. So they come back in, they shut all the doors, they lock everything, they shut the blinds, and they say, okay, all we can do is just get a knife out of the kitchen, each of us, and just be armed until our parents come back. So they all grab a knife except for the youngest brother, and they all retreated to their rooms and basically just waited for their parents to come home. An hour later, Kim's parents are still gone and all the kids are still in their rooms, and her younger brother gets hungry and he decides to go down to the kitchen to get a bowl of cereal. So he goes downstairs and he's getting his cereal together, and he starts feeling like someone is watching him. And he's looking around and he knows all the curtains have been drawn and everything's locked and shut, and he's just psyching himself out, but he notices the French doors that are leading to the side of the house. Those have glass panes on them and there's nothing covering them. And so as he's getting his cereal together, he finds himself constantly looking over at this door, and finally he decides, okay, I'm gonna put my cereal down and just go look out the glass, just make sure no one's there. And so he walks a little bit closer to these doors, and he gets about, 5-6 feet away, and the glare from the lights above still make it impossible to look out this glass. And so he's kind of squinting his eyes, but he can't see anything. And so he steps forward and he puts his hands like this, and he looks right out one of the panes of glass. And staring back at him is Dr. Ramsey, who's probably been there the whole time. And he's just standing there looking at him. And he freaks out, he screams for his brothers, and as soon as he turns back around, Dr. Ramsey has run away, he's gone. All of the siblings come pouring downstairs, knives in hand, and they're asking what's going on, and the youngest brother is trying to explain that he just saw Dr. Ramsey right on the other side of this door, and the older brothers go running outside, they're screaming for this guy, they're looking for him, but he's gone, and they all come back in the house, and they don't know what to do, and so they all stay up together in the kitchen with their knives, with everything shut and locked, just waiting for their parents to come back. And shortly after they hear their parents using their keys to come in the house, they come in and the kids explain what happened to their parents, and the parents feel horrible. And they're like, I'm so sorry that we left. We should never have left you guys. But as horrible as this was for the family, when they call the police, they can't really do anything because he wasn't there now. Nobody got hurt. Nothing was taken. And they don't even know what this guy's name is. And so they just said, stay inside, keep everything locked, and let us know if he comes back. A couple of horrible weeks for this family goes by where they're living in constant fear. The parents are never away from their kids. The father had to take time off from work. It's just this very stressful time where they are totally prisoners in their own home. And after about 2 weeks of this, Kim is at school. She's at recess with her class outside, and she was playing on the playground when she looks out at the road and she sees Dr. Ramsey in his car parked, waving at her and yelling her name. And so Kim is horrified. She turns and runs to her teacher and she points at him and she says, that guy's stalking our family. I have to go inside and tell my parents. They immediately took this very seriously. They took Kim inside to the principal's office and they called home to Kim's mom. And when she picks up, Kim's mom explains that she just got a call from the school office asking her to verify whether her husband was going to be picking up Kim from school early. And Kim's mom said, no, he's not picking her up. There's no one picking her up early. And that's when they put it together that Dr. Ramsey must have been in touch with the school to try to convince them that he was Kim's father and he was here to pick her up, and that's why he was parked outside. Kim's mother is horrified because she's thinking to herself, if the school hadn't been diligent to confirm this, there's a chance they would have given her child to Dr. Ramsey. This proved to be kind of like the final straw. Even though there was a whole bunch of final straws along the way, this was the one that ultimately pushed Kim's father over the edge. That night, Kim was sleeping in bed when she woke up because she was thirsty, and she goes downstairs to the kitchen, and she's surprised to find her father is sitting at the kitchen table, the lights are off, and he's got a gun in front of him, and he looks totally disheveled and upset, and she knows right away that this is because of Dr. Ramsey. She's not thinking this is anything else, and so she walks over to the sink and just kind of ignores the fact that this is happening. She gets a sip of water, and then she sits down with her father and says, is everything okay? And her father looks up and he just says, no, I'm not okay. I'm tired of leaving the house and wondering if when I come home, my family's not going to be there anymore. I'm tired of not being able to protect my own kids. I'm tired of this. This has to end. Kim didn't know what to say, so she just sat there in silence with her father until he told her to go back to bed. Kim says after this night, they never heard from Dr. Ramsey again. It was like he vanished off the face of the earth. No more phone calls, no more drive-bys, no more anything. He was just gone. And while we don't know for sure what happened to Dr. Ramsey, I think it's safe to assume that Kim's father had something to do with it. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak in to the 5-star review button's house and remove all the strings from their sweatpants. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Amazon Music, because starting November 1st of this year, 2022, our podcast is only going to be available on Amazon Music. However, from now until November 1st, you can still get the podcast on all platforms. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballin Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballin Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallin, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballin.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.